Hello, everybody, and welcome to our research session today. For those who are less familiar with the Jain Family Institute, I'll just give a little bit of an introduction. Some of you know each other, some of you know our researchers really well. My name is Hala Ahmed, and I am the Policy and Public Relations Lead for JFI. So the Jain Family Institute is an applied social science research institute based in New York, nonpartisan. And we have three core research areas and practice areas. The first is guaranteed income, which is the reason that you all are here today, I think. And the second is higher education finance. And the third is digital ethics and governance. We also have an independent publication of research and writing across the social sciences, and a fantastic JFI sources letter that features compelling research across the social sciences. And I'm glad to say that it actually comes highly recommended by many of our partners. Perhaps many of you here today also read it. And our publication is called Phenomenal World, so perhaps some of you have seen it. Molly will drop a link to those things in the chat in case you're curious to check it out and sign up. So in our guaranteed income work, just to say a little bit before I pass it over to our speakers to talk about their paper for today, JFI's work covers a wide swath of things. So the first is our largest project is in Maricá, Brazil, which is one of the largest basic income policies currently implemented in the world. And we're very excited about learning many things around larger macroeconomic effects of guaranteed income in that space. But we're also engaged in smaller pilots in the United States, the most exciting and recent of which is our city-based pilot in Compton, California, which is the largest sustained city-based guaranteed income so far in the United States, in Compton with Mayor Asia Brown and the Fund for Guaranteed Income. And we also engage in macroeconomic modeling work with some of our partners as well. So we've worked with a variety of governments and nonprofits, advocacy groups. We've advised on a number of cash transfer initiatives at the legislative level. And we feel in strong partnership with all of you, many of whom have become close partners in this work and whose research we've relied on a lot as we undertake more research into guaranteed income policy and cash transfers writ large. So the motivation for this guaranteed income work and this paper series in general, I'll let Steve speak to more, but it's worth saying that our work has expanded a lot in 2020. Many of you may have thought of guaranteed income as really peripheral in past years and over the past decade even though it's a longstanding policy idea with a lot of history of pilots and research and a lot of empirical evidence in its favor. And what we saw is cash transfers as a major response to the pandemic and as a really key response to helping individuals when the social safety net as it is was unable to meet individual need, when work disappeared, and when the larger economic downturn affected everybody. So in this crisis, we've seen a dramatic increase in interest in guaranteed income policies. We've seen it at every level of government, multiple bills proposed, and we'll continue to see it. And it leaves a really open question of how we will address the practical questions around guaranteed income, which is really the subject of these papers. So I'll pass it over to our speakers with a short introduction and some housekeeping. Michael Lewis is Associate Professor at the Silberman School of Social Work at Hunter College. And Sidhya Balakrishnan is the Director of Research at the Jain Family Institute. She leads research and design and analysis for JFI's basic income pilots, and she researches the implications and alternatives to student debt. So she works across our policy areas. Stephen Nuñez is JFI's lead researcher on guaranteed income and has over a decade of experience in research and program evaluation related to welfare policies and economic inequality. So I'm very excited to have them all share with you their paper today. So briefly, some housekeeping, and welcome to everybody who just joined in. I'm sorry if you were in the waiting room for long, as we did just a brief set of introductions. This session is recorded, so I hope that all of you will engage in the discussion portion of the event after the presentation. But if you would like to remain anonymous and keep off of the recording, please just turn your video off and you can put your questions in the chat and I will read them out. We'd like to have a really robust discussion today because we have a great group of people to talk to today, all of you. But we want to keep the question and answer for after the remarks. We're going to have the first portion, roughly 30 to 45 minutes of the presentation, and then a full discussion afterwards. We've left a lot of time for that. And finally, I'll just say, we're all in good company today. Today, we have a lot of folks who, like I said, have done work on cash transfer research and policy, friends and former colleagues from the Aspen Institute, Urban Institute, LIFT, various academic partners. And I know Michael will say more to this when he starts the discussion. But we're in good company, so feel free and welcome to engage in what we hope will be a really exciting discussion about this paper. And we hope it answers some important questions in this space of guaranteed income. So with that, I will share my screen to get us started with the presentation. And give me just a moment. And while I'm doing this, if anyone has any trouble hearing me, please do use the chat to let me know. I definitely don't want that to happen. Here we go. Off to you, Steve.
Okay, could you go on to slide number 3, please? And one more, yes. All right, hi everybody, I'm Steve Nuñez. I am the lead researcher on guaranteed income at the Jane Family Institute. Oh, can we go back one? Sorry. And just to give you some context for this this paper is actually the second in a series, a white paper series that we launched this year called From Idea to Reality, Getting to Guaranteed Income. That's looking at maybe some of the practical considerations in actually developing and implementing a guaranteed income policy. We started off at the Jane Family Institute doing a lot of work designing pilots and pilot materials and consulting with cities and nonprofits that are particularly interested in doing guaranteed income. And as we worked on that, we saw an enormous amount of momentum building up around this, and also some misconceptions, I think, about the purpose of these pilots and the state of the research. We believe that there's already a very solid research base, a very solid evidence base for guaranteed income to be considered as a practical policy. And what we wanted to do was to make sure that in parallel to the research that's going on, because we do think that there's important research to be done, including pilot research, that there are questions to be answered. But in parallel to that, we wanted to start working on some of the details of guaranteed income policy implementation, including things like the implications for how you finance it, what that would do, what sorts of systems are already in place to identify and individuals and to disperse cash to them. That was in fact the focus of the first paper that we called Building a Helicopter. The political economy of it, so certainly issues around public opinion and what is and is not politically feasible. And then this paper, which is what would a guaranteed income policy actually look like in practice? What form would it take? And what role could it play in the safety net? And in doing so, think through what sorts of programs it might displace and what sorts of programs it might complement. So we're hoping over the next few months to continue to release papers on this. The next paper, as you can see, is going to be on the macroeconomics of guaranteed income and some of the implications of different financing strategies. There's just been a lot of work on this over the last, say, year or so, after a long period where it hasn't really been looked at in great depth. So we're very excited to be talking about that. So next slide. So I think probably what we have to do before we start is to define what we mean by guaranteed income. I think one issue in this field is that people mean different things by different terminology. So for the purposes of our paper, we're using the term guaranteed income to discuss cash transfer policies that are universal rather than targeted, that are not conditioned on unemployment, training, or other activities, and that utilize a pay now, tax later sort of approach rather than upfront means testing. And if you use that definition, that is actually, it captures a variety of different possibilities in terms of program design. So certainly a universal basic income, $12,000 a year, paid out monthly, something like the freedom dividend that Andrew Yang proposed would count as a guaranteed income. But so too would something like the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, which is provided in an annual lump sum, and is usually more like $1,500 per person. So obviously that's not something that you can live on by itself. So it's not basic in the sense that is often used, but it's still a guaranteed income using this definition. And I think, our sense is that there's a lot of agreement out there amongst guaranteed income advocates, and even those who are sort of opposed to it, even those who are maybe sympathetic but skeptical, that there's a need for change and for reform in our social safety net. But at least in the space of those who are advocates for a guaranteed income, for UBI, whatever you might want to call it, there's considerably less consensus about what this would look like in practice. So if you happen to be, on the libertarian right and support a UBI, then I think the question maybe is quite simple. You just get rid of the entire safety net and replace it with a UBI. But if you are not, then you have an interesting question, which is how exactly do you expect this to fit into the safety net, and what is it going to look like in practice? And you may hear people say things like, well, we might want to take SNAP and replace it with a UBI and other such programs. But beyond that, there's not a lot of detail. So I think the impetus for writing this paper was saying, we want to be able to provide that detail. We want to think through what these issues are. One, what would a guaranteed income look like in terms of size and frequency of disbursement? What kind of evidence is there around that? And what kind of evidence do we need to collect to really optimize there? And then what sorts of programs might a GI, a guaranteed income, replace, and which should remain? And that certainly gets into, what is the role of a guaranteed income in the safety net? And therefore, what are the roles of the other programs in the safety net that currently exist, even if they might not be particularly good at what they're supposed to be doing? And then certainly, guaranteed income is giving people cash. And there's an assumption there that they're going to be able to use that cash in a well-functioning marketplace on some level. So there's another question, which is what sorts of other government interventions might be necessary in particular markets or in particular contexts to sort of optimize the guaranteed income? What's going to make it work best in housing and childcare and so forth? So those are the topics of this paper. We're going to turn first to issues of size and frequency. And I am going to turn that over at the stage then to my colleague, Sidhya Balakrishnan, who's going to speak about that. So go to the next slide.
Yes. Hala, next slide, please. Yes. So as Steve mentioned, there are different kinds of programs which can be categorized into guaranteed income, and they all differ in terms of what frequency at which payments are being disbursed. Andrew Yang's freedom dividend is monthly. The Alaska Permanent Fund is lump sum. And we think this is an important consideration for policymakers in general to understand how frequently should we disperse a guaranteed income policy. So first, I'll talk about why this is important. And second, I'll talk about what we can do or what can research do in order to add evidence to this question. So the reason this is important is that we do see that households have credit and savings constraints. We also know that households have income volatility. They can have a systemic shock, either an unemployment or an emergency personal expenditure, which can change their needs for cash at different points in time based on their different, the place they're in at that moment. In order to answer this question, however, we need to understand what these credit and savings constraints are and whether they do exist. So what we do know is from Kenya's Give Directly work is that we saw an unconditional, more frequent transfer is typically used to smooth consumption and meet daily needs, while a large lump sum transfer is used for large lumpy assets and investments. This does show that there are credit and savings constraints in the developing country context. However, we do have very, very limited evidence from the United States or in high-income countries in order to understand what kind of credit and savings constraints exist. There is some work with the EITC where we see, at least the EITC, of course, is conditional and we cannot count it as a GI policy, but the EITC generally, evidence shows that it's used for paying off debt, vehicles, and savings. And there was a pilot in Chicago where they did a periodic payment where they saw that it reduced financial stress and it reduced the debt accumulation. So that is lending itself to a hypothesis that there is credit and savings constraints here. And Jonathan Murdoch and Rachel Schneider's work at the Financial Diaries also indicates the same. But there is a need to examine it through research. And by research, I mean empirical research and pilots, because it's very hard to try to use disparate studies to understand this. So a multi-armed large pilot study will be amenable to answer this question. So that's the answer to what research can do. So given that there's so much momentum with Mayors for Guaranteed Income and the large influx of public attention and politicians' attention on guaranteed income pilots, we believe that these pilots and empirical research through these pilots can help us answer the question on credit and savings constraints, as well as understand what kind of payment schedule works for whom and when. Next slide, please, Hala. So the next question is on amount. So when we talk about guaranteed income, typically people say it should be large enough, but what exactly does that mean? What is large enough? Is it Andrew Yang's $1,000 a month? Is it what Stockton's doing, which is $500 a month? What exactly would be the optimal amount, and why should we be talking about it? The reason we should be talking about it is because we have two different issues that we're trying to address here. One is the differential return per dollar, and then the second would be the highest return per dollar. So the differential return per dollar would be that we cannot assume linearity of effects with a small amount and a large amount, and we cannot assume linearity of effects on all outcomes. We've, again, taking the Kenya example, we do see that it's somewhat less than proportional. So there is evidence there on decreasing returns to large transfers, but we do not have, again, a multi-armed study in developed country context, which lends itself to answer this question. This is also very critical for poverty trap literature in order to understand exactly how effect sizes or response curves move with an additional dollar that you're paying. That's the first question we want to answer when we're thinking about amounts. The second would be, what is the highest return per dollar spent, given that we are in a world with a budget constraint? If we can achieve, say, 80% of the benefit with 50% of the transfer amount, this is important for policymakers to know and understand in order to optimally design the amount of cash transfer, which has the maximum benefit, as well as the maximum return per dollar. Again, here, what we think empirical research and pilots can lend itself to in order to answer this question is to have this be an important research question in terms of how to optimally design the policy. There are very, very few research studies which are addressing this question, and we think that the momentum around guaranteed income, especially in the United States, should address specifically optimal design questions. At the same time, these pilots, of course, have to be large enough to provide robust evidence, and they should also be fairly, we think they should be fairly broadly targeted, given that we are talking about the issues of arbitrary means testing. And if they're sufficiently large enough and all of these arms, we can feasibly have amount and frequency answered in these questions, these pilots and empirical studies can also lend themselves to look at differential effects for different subgroups. Because we do know across the income spectrum, as well as different demographic populations, we can see differential effects. So what we see as a parallel conversation with the conversation about how a guaranteed income policy would fit into the social safety net is also to think very carefully about how to optimally design this guaranteed income policy. We think of these as parallel approaches to the conversation, and thinking about guaranteed income interacting with the social safety net, we need to also think about what does it add and what does it not, what needs to be supplemented. And Steve is going to talk about that. That is the second section of our paper.
Hi. So the central claims of our paper, or at least the second part of our paper, is that when you look at the safety net programs, it's worth thinking about two roles that they play. Some will focus more on one than the other. One is the idea of income support, and the other is the idea of insurance. Income support being that you are providing people with sort of a continued support, continued stream of income for the purposes of dealing with chronic material hardship and insufficiency of income in order to smooth consumption. And the second is a public insurance component, which is protection against a large income or cost shock, something that is can greatly affect the finances of a household, whether or not they were previously experiencing any material hardship. And our argument is that a guaranteed income is best thought of as a type of income support program, in that it plays the role of income support program very well, but it does not play the role of public insurance very well. And that in fact, if you try to replace public insurance programs with guaranteed income, you're not necessarily going to end up in a good situation for a variety of different households. So when I say income support programs, I mean things like SNAP and EITC and TANF. And I think there are reasons to want to consider replacing those with a guaranteed income. They are burdensome on recipients through their means testing, through the conditionality and the paperwork that's associated with that. They also are often narrowly targeted, meaning that there are groups of individuals who essentially, including individuals who are below the poverty line or near the poverty line, who receive little to no aid. And we think that a guaranteed income could be a replacement for such programs because it could provide a more generous and less burdensome aid experience to current recipients, and it would also cover individuals and households that are currently falling through the cracks. However, when I talked before about pairing guaranteed income with things, guaranteed income being, handing people cash and saying, go out into the marketplace and purchase as you see fit, works best when markets work best. So market failures may mean that there may be some sort of supply side intervention that the government may want to be involved in. The second thing, and I think this is very important, and I'll speak about this a tiny bit in the next slide, is that there are households that receive multiple benefits. And even if individual benefit programs, as burdensome and stingy as they might be, could be nicely replaced with a guaranteed income, there are some households that receive multiple benefits, some of them very important benefits, like, for example, housing choice vouchers or so forth. And for those folks, there's certainly a possibility, depending on the size of the guaranteed income, that those multiple benefit households could be made worse off if we just said, imagine a hypothetical scenario where we're getting rid of all these income support programs and we're replacing them with a single guaranteed income. And then, of course, there's also these implementation considerations, like, for example, the fact that SNAP already has a EBT system in place that could potentially be of use, or that EITC has state top-offs that are anchored to the federal EITC that lead to sort of implementation sort of considerations and challenges in any sort of transition to a guaranteed income policy. So can we go to the next slide, please? So, U.S. safety net programs are typically targeted and conditional on work, especially if you're an able-bodied adult without dependent children in the household. The conditionality might be quite extreme if there's any aid at all available, and certainly restricted in use, meaning in this case that you may receive vouchers rather than cash, meaning that you have to spend the money as the folks who develop the policy have determined you should spend the money. There are certainly, as I mentioned, major administrative burdens for the recipients through means testing and conditionality. And for those who actually do receive multiple benefits, there is the issue of multiple benefits cliffs and trying to figure out the exact right amount of money that you can earn without essentially making yourself worse off in some way. One thing I think is interesting, there's often a discussion theoretically about, well, if you have the same pot of money and you have a targeted program, you can spend that money give a lot of aid to a small group of people and perhaps get the most out of that aid, depending on the depth of need. Or you could do a universal program and you can sort of spread it across a whole group of different people. And you can think about decreasing utility and receiving cash and so forth. But in the case of the US programs, I think most people don't realize just how stingy US programs actually are on despite their targeting. So it turns out that a guaranteed income, even of the sort that we're talking about, $6,000 a year, $12,000 a year, or maybe even a little bit less than that, is actually going to be not just taking the same amount of butter and spreading it over more bread, but is actually going to represent a major expansion of the safety net in terms of the funding that would go into income support programs. So again, if you look at guaranteed income versus SNAP and WIC, or guaranteed income versus EITC, or guaranteed income versus TANF, you're going to be providing, in general, much more generous and less burdensome aid than these programs. Obviously, there are programs like, say, SSI or housing voucher assistance where that might not be the case. Now, it is the case that most households that do receive pre-tax benefits, let's take EITC out for a second, really only receive SNAP and or Medicaid. But there is a substantial minority that receive 3 or more benefits. And yes, some of those are very small benefits, a little bit of money supporting utilities or payments or whatever, but some of them are actually quite substantial, like if you happen to receive SSI or a housing choice voucher and you live in a high median cost of living metropolitan area. So even though these folks might be better off in the sense that they now don't have to worry about the multiple benefits cliffs and the paperwork and the meeting with case managers and so forth, they may actually end up worse off just in terms of net income because the sorts of typical GI guaranteed income that we're talking about are, in practice, generally less than the combined benefits for this subset of households. So then the question is, well, what do we do about that? And I mean, one possibility, and I'll talk about this more in the income situation, the insurance section, is, you can just increase the guaranteed income, assuming that you could actually do this, politically speaking. But another possibility is that we just leave some of these programs in place because we recognize that there are always going to be some households that are going to be made worse off without them, because even if the average household is better off. And when you look at something like HCV in public housing, and you say, oh, this is going to be, they spend about $20 billion a year in this benefit, that is not a very large amount in terms of the federal budget, and it's certainly not going to contribute much to the financing of a program like a guaranteed income. So, now imagine make housing benefits into an entitlement. Okay, so now you're at something at $60 to $80 billion. Again, you're still not really making a huge dent into the financing of a guaranteed income. So you don't really gain much in terms of getting us toward the world of guaranteed income by removing these programs, if the issue is that you want to remove these expenditures and sort of transfer them over. So I think we talk about this a bit in the paper, but the thought is a transitionary period, or just accepting that some of these programs are going to have to continue to exist and not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, I think is certainly like one of the topics that we wrestle with a bit in the paper. Could you go to the next slide? We're also talking about public insurance programs. And here, I guess I want to talk about insurance products in general. And I think insurance products are generally a superior or cost-effective way a more cost-effective way of handling large income and cost shocks, in the sense that they're much cheaper than using savings and credit that you've sort of built up together, or built up for yourself, in anticipation of some sort of event, because of the risk pooling inherent in insurance, right? You can spend a whole lot less money, every year to cover yourself than to have, $5,000 or $6,000 or $10,000 sort of set aside, ready to go just in case. You can certainly see that with things like, subprime lending markets, where, if there were some sort of insurance against the sorts of expenditures that lead people into taking out payday loans, it would be absolutely superior to doing it in the way that they're doing it. There's also an additional issue, which is just, even if you had the resources necessary to effectively save and buffer yourself against this, or to clear out, credit, on your credit card or whatever, it can be quite difficult to gauge the actual risk that the event is going to occur, and the length and depth of that event. You can look at, for example, unemployment situations, where you can look at what people's expectations are as to how long they expect to be unemployed, and how quickly they believe they're going to be able to find a suitable job that will actually get them up close to where their earnings were prior to having lost their job. And then you can look at the reality, and they're often like not the same. So you're actually asking a lot for people to be able to effectively gauge that risk. So I think if there were private insurance products available, it's certainly a better idea to buy them than to do with the savings and credit approach. And guaranteed income works fine there. You give people money, they can use some of it to buy the insurance, and they're covered. But we have incomplete insurance markets. There are no insurance products that cover for some of these sorts of major events that we think of, or they don't cover fully. So certainly we're thinking about things like unemployment and disability. I had a conversation with my co-authors about this. We put, although Social Security plays an important role in income support, I think it's also worth remembering that Social Security is an insurance program, that it protects folks by providing survivors benefits. It protects folks because who've had to find themselves having to retire earlier than they had anticipated because of health problems or other issues. So it's also certainly an insurance mechanism. And there is not great insurance available on the private market to cover for such things. So a guaranteed income, if you're going to want to cover for this, would be not just an expensive, but a potentially very error-prone way of doing it, because you'd have to create this sort of savings and credit strategy, because there is no public insurance provision. So here's where we're basically saying that a guaranteed income is no replacement for something like unemployment insurance or SSDI, or Social Security, even if Social Security were a smaller amount, and even by the income support conception of Social Security pays out a whole lot more than what you would typically assume for a guaranteed income. And I have a little note here just pointing out that there are other reasons why we might want to have the government intervene in health insurance markets, even though certainly there are markets for catastrophic health insurance, and also that there are issues that are not about missing insurance, but rather the other parts of the health insurance bundle that aren't technically insurance, covering routine medical care and visits and so forth. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, I mean, just as a hypothetical, what would happen if you replaced these sorts of programs with a guaranteed income? Say you got rid of, unemployment insurance. What would happen? Well, certainly if you are one of the workers who doesn't qualify for unemployment insurance, well, great, good for you. And if you are a worker who does, probably the average household would be better off in a given year because they're getting the guaranteed income and they aren't experiencing the adverse event or not experiencing a particularly adverse event in a manner that would actually make them worse off. So if you are getting unemployment insurance in Alabama or Arkansas, or you're only unemployed for 3 or 4 weeks, then maybe you're better off in this scenario. But if you're getting unemployment insurance, if you would have been getting unemployment insurance in New Jersey or Washington State, where things are much more generous, and maybe you're unemployed for half a year because there's a recession or because of something's localized issue with your industry or whatever, you might be quite a bit worse off. So that's what I'm saying here. The tails will suffer. This is something that's going to be almost like a lottery in a given year. You may end up being in one of the tails, and you may suffer quite severely. And maybe you don't this year, and then next year you're rolling the dice again. So this is going to depend a lot, and we can't really get into this in this kind of paper on the specific things like household composition, whether if you have a big family and everybody's getting a guaranteed income and individual income, maybe you're still better off, even in a bad situation. If it's a $12,000 or an $18,000 guaranteed income versus a $6,000 income, maybe you're better off, under the status quo ex ante. But I think what I want to say here is that, again, at great expense, you could almost certainly create, in an ideal world, you could say like everybody gets a $24,000 a year guaranteed income, or everybody gets a $50,000 a year guaranteed income. But you're kind of running up against certainly the issues of political feasibility, but also just the cost effectiveness that we're talking about. This is give everybody this amount of money just to make sure that a small number of people who have very deep shocks are not made worse off. And certainly there's a lot of other important and valuable things that the government can do and services that they could provide that money could be going to. So it's worth thinking about this as is this the best way to provide that for a coverage? As an aside, I want to note that in the discussion, thinking about public insurance and income support, one of the things I really think we thought about was, on the left, there's a debate, at least in the online left, constantly about, a jobs guarantee versus a UBI. No, we should do this, not the other one. And they're really two different things. A job guarantee is much more like a public insurance provision. So it kind of fits more of the role of UI. For better or for worse, depending on your political opinion. So the idea that they're substitutes doesn't really sort of mesh with this sort of way of thinking about that. They really are just solving two different problems, or at least they are geared more towards solving two different problems more efficiently. And I guess I think this is just an interesting idea in general to think about, because you're seeing it right now in the current debate that's happening over the next round of pandemic relief. Yesterday there was a big, battle on the Senate floor between and in conferences between Joe Manchin, who supports a much more a much stronger unemployment insurance expansion, a longer expansion and a deeper expansion. And Bernie Sanders, who's saying, given the pot of money that we have, some of that money should be diverted to to cash payments. Now, certainly, there's a lot of different implications in that, including getting aid to people who aren't covered by UI. But again, this sort of debate is coming up, and in a perfect world, there's the wonderful meme, why not both? But given a particular budget constraint, these are the sorts of sort of conversations that we're going to have in terms of what the safety net should look like. So with that, I want to turn this over to Michael Lewis, who is going to summarize, I think, some of our points and help prompt some discussion amongst the group. So thank you.
Thanks. If you're anxious to get involved and speak, we're almost done. So hold on a little bit longer. I do want to summarize sort of the end of the paper, the next couple of slides. And really, these are just some of the thoughts we had, the questions we had after going through the parts that were discussed earlier. And so one topic that came up for us is this whole question of the distinction between public insurance and income support that Steve just talked about. And the way we frame this is we said, as he just said a few minutes ago, that you could imagine a large GI that is meant to cover some of these things that we're saying might be better covered by public insurance. But that large GI for now seems to be outside the realm of possibility politically. Changes, it's not always clear what's possible. I mean, that's dynamic, but I don't think it would be staying too much to at least assume that a very large UBI that would cover some of these insurance provision like needs might be politically questionable at the moment, right? So we could imagine doing that, but that might not be all that possible. And so given that advocates for UBI, or even those who are opponents of UBI, may find more reason to oppose it, but serious advocates of UBI may want to consider sort of where UBI can do the most good, or some kind of unconditional cash transfer benefit can do the most good, and where other reforms might do other things and meet other needs better. So sort of what's the role for UBI that maybe be more realistically possible in terms of its amount? What's the role for that, and what might be left for other kinds of benefits or services, either cash-like benefits or services that Steve mentioned, but in the paper we go into more details about how we might want to address zoning and things like that to deal with housing markets and things like that. So that's what two sets of issues that came up. And we call that sort of the cost effectiveness questions. I mean, like, sort of what is the best use of UBI or GI? I keep saying UBI because in my mind, UBI and GI, given the GI definition we're using, are the same thing. But that's so. What is the best use of a GI given realistic amounts that we can actually foresee, or more realistic than like the more extreme, amounts? So that's sort of two sets of questions. And then the first two, the other two have to do with this question of how we might finance a GI through pruning or consolidating existing programs, and the degree to which that's possible. As Steve suggested, because of the current spending on many income support programs, If we thought of transferring some of that money to a GI, we might not get as much as we think, because for many of the programs, TANF being one I have in mind, we don't really spend that much on them now. And so we may get some revenue from transferring money from financing those programs to a GI, but perhaps not as much as we think. And so a GI may require new taxes. And as I say this, I'm thinking about stuff I've read recently. In fact, I read something on Twitter last night about MMT, and I think Pavlina Cherneva, I think the last name is pronounced. Pavlina, I know her as Pavlina. She wrote about MMT, and I think Max Sawicki, who's here, I believe. I read a response by Max on this. And it was about MMT, modern monetary theory, and to what degree that theory means that constraints on spending are not, I'll say, not as binding as we think. I always say that I'm more of a micro, to the extent I understand economics and I studied it. I'm more of a microeconomic economist, more public finance. I know more about that than macro. So I listen to these MMT debates as more of an outsider. But I understand that according to some folks who profess that theory or that model, we may not have to pay for basic income through new taxes, because the constraints on the federal budget aren't what we think. I just acknowledge that I understand that's an issue out there, but for many people, I think that it's not unreasonable to think that maybe new taxes will be required, because we can't get that much revenue from cutting spending on current programs. That's that third bullet point. And so given that we may require new taxes for GI, given we can't get that much revenue from spending on current programs, we do need to understand something more about the effects on the economy of different kinds of spending, the effects of course, the effects on people and their welfare. And we want to think about whether or not on income support or the insurance-like programs, whether these new taxes to finance GI. I mean, so we want to think about whether or not the spending we do and the type of spending we do is worth the cost. Because if the MMT folks are not right, and I don't know if they are, and the constraints are more binding than we think, we do have to think about whether or not any spending we do is worth it. So that was sort of some of the things we thought about near the end of the paper. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do now is continue our summarizing at the end of the paper and considerations we raised. And these just are more questions that we raise for folks out there who are involved in this whole discussion of GI and related policies. Well, the first two questions are more general, and the second two questions are more for the attendees here. I'll get back to that. In the real world of politics, I mean, we often, whether we are BI supporters or GI supporters or not, we often have ideal policy preferences, ideas about what we want to see happen. But often we can't quite get there, right away. And we have to sort of incrementally work toward those things. And so these first two questions are really about possible steps toward AGI. So the GI-like policies that may be steps toward that, and whether or not, I guess how to think about those, I guess is more the question. So one we thought about is maybe a first step would be a robust child allowance. Not a UBI because it's not universal, or it's not a GI in a universal sense, you could say, because it's for families, households with children. But within households with those structures, It's universal in that sense. I mean, it's not means tested within households with children. So it's sort of a step toward a UBI or GI, you might say. And would that be a good way to go as a first step? I mean, would that be something that's a compromise on GI, but a compromise that may be a step toward that? That's something to think about. And there may be others, but that's one we thought about toward the end of the paper. But we also raised the question of whether or not a child allowance, and by extension, any other incremental step toward UBI might not really be a step toward UBI, but it may be the end of the UBI or GI discussion, because people may sort of see that as a substitute for GI and just stop there. Like, I mean, if we got a child allowance, would that then dissipate the interest and the idea that there's a further need for a GI because we have this child allowance, which would be something the US doesn't quite have in the form that some European countries do. So that may be seen as a big step, and we need to do more. So will the allowance be a step toward a GI or the end of the GI discussion? That's sort of one thing we raised at the end of the paper. And then there are questions we have for the attendees. And that's because we looked at, I mean, we know who's here. Many of you are connected to or were connected to organizations that have done a lot of work on cash assistance, if not GI-like policies. Aspen's here, I heard. Urban Institute, I think. Folks are here, I believe. I think MDRC. And so there are others. I mean, I'm sure I'm missing some, but those are some of the organizations that people either work for or have worked for. I know some people here. I know of many of you. I know the names. And so all of you have done work in this area or unrelated topics. And so given that, and given all the brain power here, these last two questions are really more for the attendees to get you thinking as we start the discussion. And this first question is really based on an assumption that we have a variety of points of view here. So there's some people who are GI supporters, some who I assume, or we assume, are sympathetic critics, unsympathetic critics. Maybe so there are probably various points of view, and given that, we're just wondering if any of the issues we raised in the paper change your perspective at all regarding guaranteed income. I mean, did it either not so much change your mind, but that's included as well, but did it change your perspective? I mean, do you see things differently having considered these issues? That's one question. And the other, having heard the presentation and or read the paper, are there follow-up questions you think need to be addressed? I mean, does the paper raise questions that you think are now, I guess, more pressing than maybe you hadn't thought before the paper? So I guess these are really two versions of the same question, you might say.
Michael, I'll chime in to say, for folks who don't want to be as part of the recording but want to chime in, you can put something in the chat for me to read out. You can message me privately in the chat. And in addition, I'll just sort of take stack and allow you all to unmute yourselves. If you want to come on video so that we can have a full discussion here. So I'll just be keeping track of the chat and calling people out who want to. So I do see a note here from Carl Widerquist, if you want to go ahead, but
the next slide is the end, so questions. So we're done, I think. Questions, so that's it.
Great. So Carl, do you want to get us started? I don't know if you can unmute yourself. Okay. I'm not sure why it says that you're in the waiting room. It doesn't show that on my end, but what I will say, I see. Okay, I will read it out. So Carl says, steps towards UBI have a bigger problem than the issue that people might stop there. Many of them, such as participation income, don't work as well as UBI, and therefore they might discredit UBI. I don't know if either of you wanted to speak to that. And then I have Indy next.
I mean, yeah, I think that's something worth considering, especially if it's something like, oh, we're going to do it, you know, through the IRS as a monthly payment, a la negative income tax, and then you get something like the universal credit sort of debacle that's taken place in the UK, where people are constantly overpaying and are essentially, you know, having money stripped back from them retroactively because they were apparently overpaid according to this algorithm, or the algorithm suggests that they in fact needed less money than they did. So now they're trying to survive for the next 2 months until they get the next payment. So there's certainly ways that you could create a program that could be an administrative disaster and that could really sour people on the idea of just handing people cash. So yeah, it's something that we'll be thinking about deeply as we turn to the next paper once I recharge over the holidays.
And Carl's also commenting, if a step incorporates the distinction between the deserving and undeserving, will bring in the complexity and cruelty of the existing system. And people will say UBI is just the same stuff. It's a really good comment, Carl. And I don't want to also detract from, folks don't need to comment with a question. If you have a comment that you want to share, we've got a lot of expertise in the room. That's also great also to weigh in on Michael's questions that he raised. So I see Indy next.
Thanks. First to the team that put this together, I have been sending some messages separately to Stephen, just emphasizing that I think it adds a lot of clarity and value to the debate. I think especially the points about the role of insurance products and of supply. You know, a lot of folks, at least left of center, who want to guarantee everyone income are nervous that it leads to voucherizing everything from healthcare to education. I think that clarity is enormously helpful and a real contribution. I want to ask if folks who are more familiar with some of the research have, this is really a political economy question, but have looked at sort of, that's an important question. And so I didn't see any mention of that here. And then I think that in addition, Michael made the point that essentially UBI and guaranteed income sort of became conflated here. I do see them as different. I see UBI as one way to get a guaranteed income. I think you can guarantee everyone income without a UBI. And I do think that I'm happy to, offline provide some explanation of that, but I think being clear about that, I was expecting a little bit more about that because the frame, which is an incredibly helpful frame of, look, we have these programs, well, how do we go from here to there, would benefit from some more acknowledgement and thinking about how non-UBI programs can actually guarantee income. That may sound absurd to some folks, but if the idea is that everyone has a certain, let's just say, monthly income, I absolutely think it's conceptually possible and probably technically possible, and maybe even more politically possible, even if you aren't actually giving everyone a payment, because some people won't leave the payment. Anyway, so I did want to just ask, though, if you all had sort of thought more about those specific sorts of issues, because I saw a bit of a comparison on, if you get rid of these programs in the US, that makes sense to maybe fold into a cash benefit. Don't worry, it's actually more generous in rich countries that don't do this, but that may not be our comparison point, right? And when I've seen simulations of what happens in the US and you get rid of the programs and you convert it to a uniform sort of UBI, you do get less poverty reduction. And I've seen that in multiple simulations. I mean, SNAP benefits can easily average 500 plus a month for folks, just for, family for perspective, never mind the CTC, ITC, et cetera.
I can respond. Is it Indivar? Is that how you pronounce it? Indivar, is it correct?
Just Indy.
Indy.
Yeah.
I'll take the second point first. UBI is defined differently among people who support it. But what I was saying is that I define it the way we defined GI in the paper. So and that's also how BN, the Basic Income Earth Network, the Basic Income Earth Network defines it. So so that's why it wasn't conflation, just synonyms, given how I defined it, right? So that's how I see it. As far as the immigration point, I have thought about that, but the person who's thought more is Michael Howard. Michael Howard is a colleague and friend, and he's written about that. So I'm going to send you to him. I don't have an answer. Ideally, in my fantasy world, a UBI would go to immigrants. It would go to immigrants. It would go to anyone who lives here, any resident who lives here. But I haven't thought it through how to do that. But Michael Howard has. So I would just, his name is Michael Howard, philosopher who's written about basic income, and I know he's written about that topic. I'd refer you to him for that.
I think I'll just put in to change my job title to lead researcher on cash transfer policy, just because it is true. I think there is some confusion around the term guaranteed income. Certainly the case of when we're talking about these pilots that are taking place under mayors for guaranteed income and, or what the Economic Security Project terms guaranteed income, there may be some ambiguity there, right? So that these pilots are targeted at people below the poverty line or 130% of the poverty line or whatever. That's not necessarily because the end goal is a policy that is targeted, but for research purposes, it may be targeted. For making sure we have the statistical power to detect impacts, it might be targeted. But that has led perhaps to some, I think, confusion even within the sort of the field about what people mean by guaranteed income. And whether or not that's just a convenience, a statistical convenience, or actually sort of an end goal.
Great. So next I have Peter.
Hi. Yeah. So in terms of advocating for a universal basic income, I've thought of as including immigrants, generous, like maybe $1,200 a month or more per adult, and maybe $600 a month or more for children. And I've also thought of it mainly in terms of income support. I've learned differentiation. That's a new thought for me and very valuable. My question may be to comment that in terms of programs that would be maintained, to me, it's always been programs like all the medical insurance, the child care, Section 8, housing assistance. Those seem like additional programs that maybe are more targeted, that even a generous universal basic income wouldn't cover. So when I've thought which programs should be covered and which ones shouldn't, that's more the distinction I made. Ones that a UBI, even a generous one, wouldn't be adequate for. So maybe you'd like to comment, one or more of you, about that approach in terms of what would be maintained and what wouldn't, compared to this idea of the insurance. So I don't know, is that clear? Yeah.
I mean, I think I tend to agree. Jim Ricchio's here. I used to work with him at MDRC, and this was a conversation we've had, many times, which is, it's raising the average versus dealing with the tails, the folks who are really who need particular aid, and to think that you can simply get rid of, all programs and replace it with one sort of, one size fits all sort of like Procrustean bed is not necessarily, a great way of thinking about cash assistance. So there are potentially going to be people who are going to need additional support in some form. It could take the place. I mean, it could take the form of something like housing vouchers or whatever. I guess there are ways you could imagine doing it, like special cost of living adjustments per like metropolitan area that would then also be provided with cash. I'm not sure if that's necessarily the way to go. I feel like, completely reinventing the wheel is not necessarily the right approach. But in general, I agree with you. I think that's what we were trying to say on this insurance stuff, that you're not going to get rid of UI, you're not going to get rid of disability insurance, that sort of stuff. But there absolutely are advocates for a basic income, guaranteed income, who say that you should, that all these programs are regressive. They're essentially provide aid via lottery, that they are that they essentially you could do better by providing just a very large cash benefit. So there is actually some discussion about that. I don't think that's where we came down. I think we came down approximately where you came down, which is that there are programs that have an insurance function, and those programs not only should not be replaced, but in many instances we should think about strengthening them. If you look at UI in an average year when there's not a crippling pandemic, states spend $50 billion a year, in very targeted aid compared to guaranteed income. So, one, you're not adding that, you're not, adding much toward the financing by removing that. Two, you could probably do a lot of good for a whole lot cheaper by, say, expanding that 50 billion to 80 billion or 100 billion, and making sure that the effective wage replacement rate is much higher. And you could do that without having to massively enhance a basic income across the board. So that's the kind of stuff that I think we're thinking through. I don't know that we solved all the problems here, but in the first paper. But I'm hoping that this is a good first stab, and that will perhaps create angry retorts in the world of UBI that will get the conversation rolling.
Thank you.
In the discussions, I've been talking about UBI for a long time now, off and on. And in the discussions I've been in, where advocates have said, as Steve said, we should replace all income supports, or even what we might call insurance programs, with a GI or UBI. It's been my sense that these, and I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, but these are folks who don't know a lot about the current composition of the U.S. social welfare system. Like they have a sense that something's wrong with it. It's unjust, it's unfair, and they support the UBI like on principle, philosophical reasons. But they don't know the structure and how the programs work and how they are designed. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to be involved in this paper, because I think that and again, I blame, I've been around this for a long time. And I know that when we first started talking about this, like the discussion about UBI wasn't where it is now. So a lot of what people were trying to do is just get the discussion going, get people talking about it again. And so that was the focus. And so there wasn't an attention to details of like what we have currently, how might this fit, what should stay. I mean, so I don't think those folks know. I mean, some cases they do, but know a whole lot about the way the system currently works. And I think if they knew more about that, they would think differently, I think.
That makes sense.
Hope it doesn't sound too harsh.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I want to note in the chat a really good point to what you just said, Michael. Part of the attention that's been drawn to some of the failures comes from this year. And as Claudia Sam mentioned here in the chat, the impact of the direct payments. So thank you for mentioning all that. And if I'll add you to the stack, Claudia, if you want to say more, definitely a lot to learn from that particular example. I have here Max Sawicki as well. If you, and just a reminder, if you want to introduce yourself, if you unmute.
Thank you. I'm semi-retired from the federal government. Now I'm associated with the Center for Economic and Policy Research, who should not be held responsible for anything I say. The papers I like a lot, the first two I've read, but there was a voice screaming in my head the whole time asking, how big is this thing? And how do you squeeze it into the existing federal fiscal system? I mean, you can't really, I don't think you can say, well, this could match up with any existing means tested income support payment, because you're going to be giving that same money to everybody else too. And you're either going to be getting that back in taxes or something else is going to happen to it. So I think you have to compare programs with similar aggregate costs to start to talk about that. A few other disconnected points. Social insurance, I like the bit that Peter Balmer mentioned about its importance relative to cash. I also think it has a political dimension relative to income support. I've always thought that the politics of it hinged, among other things, on the fact that it's contributory, unlike means-tested benefits. And that's going to have a bearing, I think, on a UBI. By the way, I've been for income guarantees since 1971 when I was working with the Welfare Rights Organization. So I'm for income guarantees. I've been waging war on UBI and to a lesser extent MMT for some years now, just to state some of my biases there. I don't think, I mean, the paper sort of worries a little bit about some people with very high multiple benefits getting harmed by a UBI. Any big change is going to have losers. So I wouldn't be, of course, it's easy for me to say because I don't depend on, you know, housing benefits or anything, at least not the means tested kind. But I think that could be loosened up a little bit as far as the way you deliberate about this. The other thing is, it's as you say in the paper, it's quite so that you need cash as well as social insurance. You can't buy, you don't want to be throwing people into the private marketplace for health insurance and things like that. There's another analog too, which I think is relevant, especially in this current downturn, which is public goods. People need public goods too, and they can't buy those with cash either. And that again goes to this problem about how you're going to trade off some gigantic new program with other priorities in the federal fiscal system. So, I mean, those are somewhat disconnected thoughts, but I like the papers a lot. I'm really looking forward to number 4, which will, I think, answer, which I hope will answer my my big question about all this. That's it.
Thank you.
I have one response. Is that okay? Am I talking too much?
Oh, fine, Michael.
It's really a response to the first part of the question. The first question. I mean, I agree with everything you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I would just be careful though that the point about cost of a UBI and how big it is. Like there's a distinction between the net cost of a GI and the gross cost. And the gross costs might look large, but a lot of the people who get the benefit won't be net recipients if we finance it in a certain way. right? So they won't be net recipients. And so what matters really is the net effect, the net cost, not the gross cost. That's only a comment on the first thing you said.
Yeah, and I have a few other names in the chat here, but just to keep us all on the same topic, I wanted to ask Claudia if you had additional thoughts you wanted to chime in here per your comment.
Yeah, thanks so much. So let's see. I'm not sure which group of whether I'm a skeptic or maybe just learning about guaranteed income. I've done a lot of research on direct payments. So like what we saw in the CARES Act, and I firmly believe that they work. And if they ever put out another relief package, it's better than nothing, what we'll get. But I do think there's a lot we can learn from this year's CARES Act, which had not only the direct payments, which were so good sized, big, and they over 85% of the US population, women, men, and children, were eligible for the first round. And it looks like the second round will include adult dependents, will be even more, right? So that's really broad-based. That was so much better than in the past. And then the other thing we saw, the weekly top-off on the unemployment benefits, like that was serious money. So between those two, there have been some really good studies. I mean, I've done some, but I linked to other people's in the chat because they were really helpful, but showing that people took that money and were creating a nest egg to the best that they could. Because I think there's a lot of discussion about like, oh, poor people just don't like know how to save or whatever. But I mean, the argument is like, if you don't make any money, like it's gonna be really hard to save. So it was a really good example of how people use that money in different ways and gave them the autonomy to decide, what do I need an extra $1,000 for? So I just think there's a really rich set of evidence, because you talked before about like, we don't in a developed country have a big experiment to look at, but I think there's probably some ways, it's different, but I think there's some ways to piece apart what's in here. The last thing I'll say is I have been really focused on the direct payments, tying them to macroeconomic conditions. So like keep them going until we're at full employment. I know that's like not quite in the spirit of what all you are thinking about, but I do, I've gotten much more interested in this over time, so.
Claudia, we've had conversations with some staffers on Capitol Hill who certainly are, they talk to us like, we want cash with the SAM rule, but we want it so that when things are going well, that there's still payments going out, and so that there's a floor, and then the floor just sort of goes up according to the SAM rule, like can you help us do that? And we'll say, yeah, we could get you in touch with Claudia if you want to hear about that. But yes, so yeah, I agree, and I think that we're very much, a lot of this conversation has been about idiosyncratic shocks to people's household income or costs, or just what's going on all the time, without thinking through just the. And another reason why we love guaranteed income is just because the conditional safety net is just it's a terrible buffer during recessions, right? It does not act in a countercyclical manner. So the paper doesn't really address sort of the macroeconomics of it and how the effect could be there. But I think that will probably end up being one of the conversational points in the paper on macro and finance coming up. If anybody is really interested in working with us on that macroeconomics and finance paper, none of us are macroeconomists, and we certainly will bring in sort of outside experts all the time. So let me know.
Okay, thank you so much for that comment. Extremely important, definitely. And I want to go to Anthony Barrow's question, but he was on the phone, so I'm going to read it out. Just curious to get a sense of how JFI is thinking about harder to quantify benefits of universality and or unconditionality, e.g., for example, lowering stigma, higher dignity. And for that matter, I mean, if some other folks want to chime in on this question on the call, interested to hear what you have to say as well.
So I think the stigma component, I'll also let Sid and Michael kick in, but the stigma component is, I like, to the extent that I've already mapped out anything about the paper on the political economy, that's certainly going to be something that we're going to talk about. And there is research around, you know, stigma and civic engagement and you know, whether universal programs are like, you know, foster more political and civic engagement and volunteerism because they remove that stigma. There's certainly the mental health component to that. So yeah, that's absolutely going to be a part of it. And there's a lot of interesting work that I don't have anything particularly deep to say about at the moment on, you know, cash and feminism and the, you know, the role that women play in the household. The idea that, you know, a lot of, when we talk about work conditioned benefits, we mean work in the certain, in terms of money, you know, work that is compensated in the marketplace, you know, for wages, not the kind of important work that you know, we would consider labor that's done at home, you know, taking care of people and that sort of stuff. So there's certainly work around that that we'd like to bring into this series going forward. There's even that stigma stuff kind of kicks in also when you think about things like you know, again, conditioning things on work. There's this idea that, you know, work brings dignity but certainly how much of that, you know, is really, you know, that there's stigma attached to the current sort of benefit system. On the other hand, you know, work is also a way for people to interact with each other, and being at home is not necessarily, you know, it can have mental health effects too. So I guess this is kind of rambly, so I'm going to stop talking. but the point is, yes, these are things that we are thinking about. There certainly, some of them are going to show up in the political economy piece, and others are probably going to come up in for future white papers when we think about things like the intersection between, you know, gender and guaranteed income, or the environment and guaranteed income. And there actually are some scholars who are doing interesting work on that.
Yeah, and our work generally, if we talk about our empirical work, stigma is one of the key outcomes we are thinking about in our work in Marika, because it is the way guaranteed income, they call it basic income or basic income for citizenship. It's designed as a rights-based, you know, rights-based approach. So we are going to be investigating how having a basic income as a right rather than something that's means tested and you're getting it because you're poor changes the way they perceive it. We've seen this, especially with Bolsa Familia. People have a negative connotation attached to it because it's for the poor, quote unquote. So that's something we are investigating there. Universality, of course, given the nature of pilots in general, you cannot really examine them in empirical research, but our next paper, which will talk a little bit about the simulation modeling, which models a universal basic income and what the effects of universality could be. It'll come soon. Yeah.
Yeah, certainly a big motivator and obstacle in our work to tackle this question of the stigma. So I have next Gabriel Matthey, just going to read it out loud because he's on his phone. So what if we look at federal poverty lines? Each additional member of a household adds, let's say, $4,480 per year, which is $373 per month to the poverty line. Why not start with a GI at, say, $400 per month, which would put all households with at least $8,000 per year in other income over the poverty line?
Could you read back the last part of the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's just basically a proposal, I think, around the amounts. I'll start from the beginning. If we look at federal poverty lines, each additional member of the household adds, you know, $4,480 a year, or roughly $373 a month to the poverty line. Why not start a GI at, say, $400 a month, which would put all households with at least $8,000 per year in other income over the poverty line? On the question of amounts.
$400 a month. Well, I think we are, in fact, what is that, $400 a month? I think we are thinking about something approximately at that level, I think, for some of the future pilot work that we're doing. I guess guaranteed income is usually thought of, or basic income is usually thought of as a perfectly individual benefit. There are variations on that, I guess, that are not universal benefits, or excuse me, that are not individual benefits, but are household level benefits that sort of scale according to the number of people in the household. And I think the work that Sid and company are currently building at the moment in Compton and elsewhere is going to, I think, be able to speak to the value of a cash transfer at approximately that magnitude. If you wanted to chime in a bit, Sid.
Yes. So yes. So $400 is one of the amounts we are investigating. I also wanted to add to Steve's point, like differentiating the amount of cash transfer by household size is also a very interesting debate and question in GI, which is also something we will be trying to understand as to how much additional money do you need per dependent in your household, for example. So 400 is one of the average options that we're looking at. But at the same time, as I mentioned in my part of the presentation initially, we do need to understand the returns per dollar, additional return per dollar, not only in terms of effect sizes, but also in terms of cost benefit analysis. So we cannot, as an empirical researcher, my interest in like looking at the amount values is just precisely to understand how much is large enough and what is needed. And I think that's the value of future pilots or large future pilots in order to answer that question.
I think that, I can't recall the name of the center, but Columbia School of Social Work has a center on poverty, poverty, something like that.
Poverty and policy, yeah.
Thank you. And I think Erwin Garfinkel and some other folks did.
Chris Weimer and Chris Weimer and Rob Hartley too.
Yeah, did a report where they actually looked at an amount for UBI, and they sort of looked at the financing, and I think it was around that amount. I think if I recall, it was around there. So I would try to, like, if you want to pursue this, it's Garfinkel, Hartley, Weimer, I think. I think.
Yep. These are micro simulations so they keep prices and wages fixed. So they're not, they don't look at the sort of, general equilibrium modeling and the sort of way that you might think, but there's a really interesting, their work on is really interesting. It looks a bit at the distributional impacts, overall poverty, and particular winners and losers under a variety of different scenarios. And I think it's quite interesting.
Yeah, thank you for calling out that work, Michael. So we're at 4:30, and that is sort of our ideal end time. But I want to note there's a really interesting discussion going on in the chat, and I'll read out some of it because I really appreciate all of you being here and contributing to this discussion. And maybe we can go around for some final comments. So I just wanted to note Rebecca Hestel from Stanford Basic Income Lab was noting there are several evidence-based evidence reviews of GI policies that were published this year that suggest the evidence is not quite settled on several outcomes of interest. It may be the case that this is because none of these programs have the full features of UBI, in which case more half measures may not build the evidence in a way that would be useful to a full UBI. And Peter Romer also mentioning that a major aspect of a generous UBI is that it increases bargaining power of workers. Definitely a question we're considering a lot in our work with some partners in Compton, Peter, for work in the households, empowers work in the household, mainly women. Also the ability to do something one likes, such as activism, being an artist, and other forms of work. Of course, these are great comments about some of the known effects. And John Watkins mentioning owners of assets have received massive subsidies, at least since the great financial crisis, in the form of quantitative easing, and UBI provides an important counterpoint to the subsidies received by asset owners. So sort of distributive economy. And to Peter's point, UBI would increase bargaining power of workers, but could also, there's a concern around it being inflationary. So actually, that might be an important point to end on, Steve, if you want to respond to that. How a UBI might relate to the idea of job guarantees, as you mentioned, which presumably would have a less inflationary impact. So if you want, maybe actually end on that note, Steve, Michael, Sidhya, around the inflationary effects that we're considering, because it relates to the next papers.
I am nowhere near equipped at the moment to say anything about the inflationary impact of a UBI versus a UBI versus a jobs guarantee. So, and I know, yes, there's price stabilities attached.
Yeah,
attached to
Esco and Damon Jones have done a bit of work on the inflationary effects of the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend. It's
Sure.
not live yet, but they don't see too many inflationary effects. And the work in Kenya also says the same thing.
Yeah, the Haushofer, the rare general equilibrium effects of a guaranteed income paper that they did there is very interesting. In terms of the inflationary effects of a job guarantee, I'm not equipped to say anything about it at this point. So I hope I will be in a few months.
And I'll mention also, we have it was a working paper published this year from some of our partners that we commissioned, a macroeconomic model of UBI in New York City. And that actually was a dynamic stochastic equilibrium model that tried to control for a lot of factors, really well built model. And it sort of projects some of the inflationary impacts, at least as well as the macroeconomic model can do outside of reality. Those effects were also minimal. And as Sidhya mentioned, the study in Kenya that came out this year from one of our partners, Johannes Haushofer, around over 10,000 households in rural Kenya found minimal price effects from the basic implemented there.
You say just to say on that, the UBI in the city, which was done with Jack Favaloukas, who's a professor of finance at the business school in the University of British Columbia. That paper was a working paper that was released using an income tax based guaranteed income in New York City. There's going to be a newer version of that paper coming out probably early next year with robustness checks and alternate financing mechanisms, including something as close to a VAT as you can get in a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. So be on the lookout for that. There'll be perhaps some more info around the inflationary effects. Thank you.
I thought the question about inflationary effects of a UBI versus jobs guarantee came out of the thought that giving workers bargaining power would be the cause of inflation. So I thought was behind the question. If that was behind the question or the comment, then that could happen theoretically, but that could also happen with a jobs guarantee too. It would depend on how the jobs guarantee is structured. If the public sector demand for employees competed with private sector demand for employees, workers would have more bargaining power. And it could also be inflationary. So it would, I mean, so it's not clear to me that one would be more or less than the other. It would depend on how they're structured, I think, theoretically.
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of the, if you have job guarantees and people are actually working and presumably they're creating output, whereas people who are receiving guaranteed income would not be. So presumably there would be less inflationary impacts with job guarantees than there would be with UBI. So the studies that you all mentioned were very interesting. I'll have to look into that.
And that wouldn't be like, wage push inflation though. That would be something else. Right?
Well, it would simply be the idea that you have people being supported and
right.
have income, but they're not producing
right.
not producing value, and the people who have job guarantees would be presumably.
Yeah, I get you. Yes,
It
yes,
just
that's-
wouldn't be makeshift jobs.
Yeah, you're saying, I mean, in other words, it's sort of like, there would not be the too much money chasing too few goods kind of inflation. With
Right. And I
guaranteed.
suspect,
Right,
and I don't have any studies about this, but I suspect
Right.
the inflationary impacts of UBI probably wouldn't be that great.
Right.
I'm very much concerned with the idea of the massive subsidies we provided to asset holders over the past decade, and I don't think people are aware or conscious because they don't understand how quantitative easing works or how the Fed works. But it's just unbelievable how well asset owners have done over the past, 12 years or so, relative to people impoverished.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for those comments, and thank you, Michael. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I'm going to paste in the chat as well and link again to our digest of social science research. Anytime there's something great related to GI, we do pop it in there. So one way to keep in touch, but a lot of other interesting topics dug into there. Thank you for joining. I hope that we'll continue the conversation, and please, reach out to JFI if you want to continue to collaborate on this topic. There's a lot of research going on in this area, and we've got a lot of folks who are engaged in that research here on the call. We want to continue to be partners and continue this discussion. So I hope you'll read the paper. Thanks again, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.